Today we're going to be talking about first and third person perspectives in PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds. Now this can sometimes be a bit of a contentious issue, but I'm not trying to be political with this video, I'm merely trying to show the main differences between the two perspectives, as well as the strengths and weaknesses depending on the scenarios and types of engagements. And as always guys, feel free to check out the description of this video so you can jump around to any of the parts of the video that you're most interested in if you don't want to sit around and watch the entire thing. So first off, I want to talk about the main differences between first and third person perspectives. This is going to be very basic for players who are well familiar with the concept, but for those who perhaps don't understand why the difference is significant, let's break it down. First person perspective is where the camera exists within a player's head, typically around eye level. That means anytime a player makes eye contact with an enemy, that enemy can also then see that player. If a barrier exists between the players, both players will be unable to see each other. Third-person perspective is different in that the camera is actually situated above and behind the player. It is a floating, invisible perspective camera. Now, in many scenarios, if a player can see an enemy, it's likely that that enemy can still see that friendly player. However, if a barrier exists that is blocking your enemy's perspective, it does not necessarily mean you will be unable to see that enemy, and vice versa. That's the main difference between first and third person. Third person allows you to get information that would otherwise be impossible to obtain, maybe because a barrier is too high, all the while letting you obtain the information risk-free. So let's see some examples in-game of how that really affects players. The first scenario we'll have is approaching a corner. Anytime you're approaching a corner as a player, you actually have no idea in third person if someone is around the other corner watching your movements. That means any corner you approach, you should always be aware of the possibility that someone might have information on you, and you'll have no way of knowing until they either pop out and attack you, or you turn the corner to then get sight lines on them. In first person, however, as long as you're approaching the corner and you don't see the enemy, you can be sure that they likely don't have information on you from that corner position. If you see their head pop up, then both of you will be aware of each other's position, and both of you are then in danger. Another common scenario is approaching a building. In third person, a player will be able to look out windows without exposing themselves at all to gain information on you as you approach the building. From the perspective of the player approaching the building, it's actually impossible to determine if there are players in the building and if the building is safe to enter or not. In first person, however, as you approach a building, you should be scanning the windows for movement, because if you see a player's head, it means both of you are now aware of each other's positions and you're both equally vulnerable to fire. Now before we go over combat scenarios, I want to discuss how aim works in this game. It's a little bit unintuitive and a little bit different than most games, where the actual bullet is fired from the perspective of the head of the player or from wherever the player's camera might be. Certain games like Counter-Strike Go do this, for example. In PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, however, the bullet does actually originate from the weapon. Now that can be a little bit confusing because that means where you're aiming won't necessarily be where the bullet will go. For instance, if you are aiming slightly above a barricade, it's likely that your bullets will actually instead hit the barricade. This effect is far more pronounced in third-person perspective than it is in first-person perspective. And also because the players in this game are right-handed, you are also more likely to strike a wall if you are leaning out the left side of a corner than you would be if you were leaning outside of the right side. In fact, if you're leaning out the right, it's almost impossible to actually hit a corner, whereas when you're leaning out the left, you will find that oftentimes your shots will hit a wall when you were hoping instead to hit a target beyond that wall. Now the game tries to alleviate this problem by showing you a red symbol on the wall if your cursor is aiming beyond that wall. However, this seems to only be limited to third-person perspective when you would be hitting the corner of a wall, and it does not show the red symbol if you would be aiming above a barricade that you're going to then hit. Not certain if this is a bug or if this is intended behavior, but it's clear that the red symbol won't always show up when you're actually going to hit a wall as opposed to the actual target you're intending to aim at. This effect can also be seen frustratingly with the bars on certain windows in certain second-story houses, where it can sometimes feel almost impossible to shoot through because no matter the angle you shoot at, your gun is always going to hit those bars. My recommendation in this situation is to lean. Leaning will bring your barrel below the bars and you'll be able to hit your targets. Now let's look at some simulated combat scenarios. These aren't meant to mirror gameplay, but are instead meant to serve as hyperbolic examples. In Battlegrounds, there's two main types of engagements. Engagements where you as the attacker have an all but guaranteed kill, and engagements where you do not have a guaranteed kill, whether that be because your enemy is too far, moving too fast, or perhaps because he is the one who has begun firing upon you. First off, let's take a look at some guaranteed kills. So to start off, we have a guaranteed kill utilizing the third-person perspective, so let's watch that now. And though it's not too complicated, let's see it again and break down what happens. Firstly, the attacker who has the third-person advantage is able to gain as much information on his enemy as possible without exposing himself to any danger whatsoever. From the victim's perspective, he had no idea his attacker was there until the moment was too late. Because he's able to line up his shot before even exposing himself, he can pop up with his aim already on target and down the victim before he's able to even react. This is the best scenario for an attacker in a third-person server. If the same scenario is restricted to first-person only, however, the engagement is more likely to be an even trade, with no player coming out on top. Though sound can be somewhat of an indicator to give advantage, it's actually impossible to gain any information until both players are equally exposed. While the third-person camera is typically advantageous for the defender, there are a few key situations where it's actually beneficial to the attacker. One obvious example is ascending stairs. Due to the elevated nature of the third-person camera, the attacker moving up the stairs is likely to actually have advantage on the person camping the top of the stairs. As with the other example, in first person only, this asymmetric advantage goes away and the fight could become an even trade. Now let's look at a common endgame scenario where the circle has dwindled and the play area is nothing more than a field. In this scenario, all players are likely to be prone for cover. In third person, it's easy to gain as much information as you want while staying completely in cover. The first person to then stand can then be targeted, lined up, and ambushed by the remaining players in cover. For this reason, it's inadvisable in a third-person server to ever be the first one to exit from prone in a field endgame scenario. In first person, however, this scenario differs quite a bit. While prone, you are in cover. However, your ability to gain information is severely limited. The field will obstruct most of your vision past a few meters. Standing, however, is also not necessarily a death sentence if the rest of your opponents remain prone and can allow you to scan the horizon and look for threats. However, as soon as more than one player is standing, they're both then exposed and an even trade is then possible. Now let's look at a situation where, when away from cover, you decide to engage an enemy, but you can't guarantee the kill. So let's break down exactly why this is a bad engagement to take. Assuming the enemy's able to escape you and manage to get to cover, you're then going to have to guess which side he'll emerge on, and you lose the ability to gather information. All the while, the enemy in cover is able to line you up and target you while remaining completely concealed. His ability to then pop out and fire upon you before you're able to react and readjust means that in that situation, he has taken the advantage away from you. In third-person servers, this is the most common type of engagement you're going to want to avoid. In first person, however, the attacker still maintains much of his advantage. Though the enemy is still able to make it to cover, he may have been injured on the way, and will still have to expose himself in order to gain information on his attacker's position. Though, like most things with first person, and because this effectively resets the engagement, a fair trade is still possible. Taking the same engagement when you have your own cover is a better scenario, however, it often culminates in a complete stalemate. In third person, the first person to leave cover will be at a disadvantage. In first person, however, this exact scenario plays out a little bit differently. In order to get information on your enemy, you will have to expose yourself, and at any point during that exposure, if the enemy pops up too, you're both vulnerable. As such, a fair trade is much more likely. Now, throwables pose a reasonable solution to the stalemate problem. However, in my experience, they weren't the easiest to use or land in the current implementation. Perhaps this will change in the future, but if you find yourself in that situation, it might be worthwhile to toss a molly or frag towards your enemy. Suppression is an interesting mechanic that actually has no place in a third-person server. Unfortunately, an enemy under fire can still gain all the information he wants about a situation risk-free, and then he has information on you that you simply don't have on him, placing you at a disadvantage. In first person, however, suppression is actually a very useful effect. Though in this clip I'm alone, I can use suppression to effectively lock a player into position, prevent him from gaining information on us, and can have a squad mate then attempt to flank or somehow maneuver around him. If an enemy chooses to fight back during a suppressive action, the fight is a little bit more fair had it been third person, however, it still typically favors the attacker. So that was a long one, but what's the takeaway? What's the conclusion? There are no first-person servers in the game right now. The developers have committed to a first-person mode, but it's currently not implemented. Third person is incredibly strong. You would be a fool not to use it. It provides a huge asymmetric advantage to those who utilize it well. Third person allows you to see over walls and to also gain information on your enemies with no risk to yourself. However, because of those aspects of third person, it means the engagements you choose to take should be ones where you can nearly ensure the kill. If the enemy you're attempting to fire on manages to get to cover, utilizing that third-person advantage, he can then turn the tables. Or the two of you could end up in a stalemate, which could potentially be resolved by a throwable, but in their current state are unreliable. First person will be a much different style of gameplay when it's implemented. The fights will be much more fair. You will have to put yourself at great risk to gain information. And also suppression will be a useful and practical effect within the game itself. Personally, I can't wait for first-person servers. I find first-person only gameplay to be much more compelling, to be much more fair. The end game doesn't feel as stale as it currently does in this one. However, that's all personal preference, and to be quite honest, once that's implemented, I won't be able to peep my sweet skins, so obviously there's some disadvantages to that as well. Guys, I hope you liked the video. As always, check the description below for my forum page where I collate all these results. Check out my Twitch, check out my Twitter. I want to give a big shout out to my friend David, LazyGun8. His Twitch is going to be down there in the description too. He spent hours helping me collect all this footage. It was not a lot of fun, so he was a real trooper for sticking it out. Thanks to all you guys. If I got anything wrong, if you disagree with me on my stances on the differences, I'm not trying to stick a stand on which one's better. I have a preference, but they both have their uses. You know, leave a comment below. Let me know if you like what you see with the OCD series. Subscribe. This is a very long outro. I am so terribly sorry for that. I'm Magnum Dopus. Keep crunching those numbers.